The Gestapo stood behind me, asking about a line I'd already buried. I thought of my cousin Willem. His silence burned with the evidence. He warned me once, helping was easy, surviving it wasn't. They left without a word. But the cables still remembered what I rerouted. By early 1943, the German occupation of the Netherlands had entered its third year. Following the rapid defeat of Dutch forces in May 1940, the country had been placed under the administrative control of Rijkskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart, a close ally of Hitler and an advocate of National Socialist policy. Civilian rule was gradually dissolved, political parties banned, and Jewish citizens systematically targeted for exclusion, dispossession, and deportation. What began with regulations soon advanced into an increasingly violent and organized campaign of repression, coordinated in large part by the Gestapo and its Dutch collaborators. Resistance to the occupation, though initially fragmented, had begun to coalesce into more defined networks. These included sabotage units, underground newspapers, and courier operations helping Jews and other targeted individuals escape the growing apparatus of Nazi control. Radio transmissions and telegraph communications played a critical role in these clandestine operations, particularly in coordinating escape routes to neutral countries and maintaining contact with the exiled Dutch government in London. Within this charged atmosphere, daily life for most Dutch citizens remained a precarious balance between survival and subtle forms of defiance. Even seemingly routine professions could hold strategic importance. In cities like The Hague, Amsterdam, and Rotterdam, individuals working in civil infrastructure, railways, postal services, and telecommunications found themselves at the intersection of German control and Dutch resistance. It was in the city of Utrecht, centrally located along vital railway lines and communication routes, that one such individual quietly occupied a post of unexpected significance. The man's name was Arie van der Veen. A career telegraph operator in his early 40s, van der Veen had worked for the Dutch PTT, Staatsbedrijf der Posterij, Telegrafie en Telefonie, since the late 1920s. His responsibilities remained largely technical, monitoring transmissions, routing cables, logging message traffic, and ensuring proper maintenance of relay equipment at the regional dispatch center. Though the telegraph office now operated under German oversight, many of its day-to-day personnel remained Dutch. This arrangement was not born of trust, but necessity. The occupiers needed the existing infrastructure to function smoothly, and they could not easily replace an entire workforce with trained German technicians. Van der Veen, like many others, had retained his post under the agreement that he would comply with occupation directives, avoid interference, and submit to periodic reviews by military supervisors. By all outward signs, he complied. Van der Veen's days were marked by routine. He arrived punctually at 7:30 each morning, removed his hat, nodded silently to the receptionist, and stepped into the transmission floor. He spoke little and listened carefully. Each message passed through his station in coded form, blips of Morse tapped out from one point and relayed to another. Most were mundane: freight updates, weather reports, troop movements filed under generic codes. Others, especially those marked with a special prefix from Gestapo command posts in The Hague or Arnhem, carried more sensitive content. These were often intercepted by auxiliary censors stationed near his desk, usually young men in field gray uniforms who did not speak Dutch fluently but were trained to flag certain patterns. It was during the winter of 1943 that van der Veen first noticed a troubling increase in traffic volume from a source node designated KHQ-4B, a Gestapo field office located in the northern province of Friesland. The messages were short, urgent, and consistently addressed to security outposts across a wide arc: Zwolle, Deventer, Apeldoorn, and even down to Rotterdam. The routing pattern suggested coordination across multiple sectors. He said nothing initially. Rerouting or holding official transmissions was prohibited. Operators who delayed or diverted priority traffic without cause faced dismissal or arrest. Still, van der Veen began taking mental notes. The messages always included reference strings that aligned with police sweeps, terms like Sauberung, cleansing, or Durchsuchung, search, followed by numerals that appeared to mark grid zones. By mid-February, the pattern clarified itself. The signals corresponded to an intensified manhunt for a group of escapees believed to be heading westward from Leeuwarden. Though no names were listed, Van der Veen inferred the targets were likely resistance couriers or Jews attempting to reach safe houses in the central provinces. Friesland's proximity to the IJsselmeer and its long coastline made it a known region for clandestine crossings, often by boat under cover of night. If escapees reached Utrecht or Amersfoort, they could be funneled into denser networks connected to Belgium or France. On February 18, Van der Veen encountered a critical signal. It bore the highest priority classification, Dringensoffert, and listed an extensive distribution chain. The message instructed all relay stations to pass on orders for roadblocks, surprise inspections, and door-to-door interrogations across a 60-kilometer corridor. One particular clause noted the inclusion of post-UND Fernmelddienst, suggesting that even postal and telegraph facilities were to be searched for signs of aiding fugitives. That evening, Van der Veen sat alone in the relay room after the night shift operator called in sick. He scanned the dispatch logs again. The volume of traffic had doubled. Many were redundant, sent across parallel lines to ensure receipt. But buried among them was a message that caught his eye, a misrouted signal from a station in Apeldoorn that was meant for Arnhem. Its checksum data, normally used to validate the integrity of the transmission, had been corrupted. He stared at it for several minutes, then made a decision that would shift the boundaries of his role. Rather than correcting and forwarding it, he flagged the message for retransmission and queued it in a batch that would not be processed until morning. He could justify this under protocol. Damaged signals were routinely delayed. But his true reason was more deliberate. By holding this message, he created a brief, localized gap in the Gestapo's pursuit grid. If the fugitives were on the move, and if they were listening to underground relays advising them of safe routes, they might gain precious time. Over the next 2 weeks, Van der Veen began to quietly test the system. On select nights, he rerouted priority transmissions through less direct lines, introducing a delay of several hours. In a few cases, he allowed corrupted messages to remain unrepaired until his shift ended, passing the burden to less experienced staff who often discarded them altogether. He was careful not to create obvious gaps, not to target any one message too frequently, and never to speak of his choices to colleagues. But as March approached, the Gestapo's network grew more aggressive. They introduced mobile transmission units and began sweeping towns with units drawn from both German command and the Dutch Ordnungspolitie. A new series of directives mandated that all operators report unusual transmission errors immediately. Censorship units were reinforced, and internal spot checks increased. Van der Veen was summoned twice for procedural reviews but was found compliant. Still, doubts crept in. One morning he arrived to find that a colleague in Rotterdam had been arrested for negligent sabotage. The man had mistakenly failed to forward a telegram involving a military convoy. The penalty had been immediate: dismissal, interrogation, and, reportedly, deportation to Germany for forced labor. Van der Veen knew the margin for error was shrinking. Every decision now carried real consequences, not only for him but for those relying on misrouted signals to slip through a tightening net. He adjusted his routines accordingly. Instead of rerouting multiple transmissions in a single shift, he began to spread delays across different hours and operators. He learned to identify the call signatures of censors least likely to notice slight discrepancies. He memorized which routing nodes were monitored by German technicians and which remained under Dutch oversight. But for all his caution, Van der Veen could feel the weight building. Each intercepted message hinted at a wider machinery closing in, on fugitives, on collaborators, and on the quiet, invisible linkages that allowed resistance to function in the first place. And then, in late March, the messages changed again. By the final week of March 1943, the coded traffic reaching the Utrecht Telegraph station showed signs of abrupt intensification. Message volume rose by nearly 30%, but more telling than the volume was the repetition. The same directives were being relayed to multiple locations across the same geographic radius: Zwolle, Arnhem, Apeldoorn, Utrecht, Amersfoort, with variations of just a few words. The priority codes remained high, the instructions increasingly explicit. The Gestapo wasn't simply conducting a search. They were coordinating a tightening ring. The tone of these transmissions, even when reduced to telegraphic brevity, suggested rising frustration. Orders now included language calling for the systematic containment of sympathetic channels, and instructions were issued to inspect secondary communication staff. This last phrase raised an eyebrow for Arie van der Veen. While the Gestapo's focus had previously been on the fugitives themselves, there was now clear interest in the infrastructure that enabled their movement: postal carriers, rail clerks, radio technicians, and men like himself. Though no names were ever included in the messages he read, van der Veen understood the implication. The escape effort in Friesland had not yet succeeded in slipping entirely beyond the Gestapo's grasp. Someone, possibly more than one, was still on the move. The directives now bore phrases like "Groot Jacht," "the Great Hunt." This was no longer a routine sweep. That same week, van der Veen learned through a whispered conversation in the staff lounge that a former colleague, Willem Coenders, had been arrested in Amersfoort. Coenders had once worked 2 floors below van der Veen at the Utrecht exchange. He had transferred in 1941, quietly, after suspicions surfaced about his involvement in unauthorized radio listening. Nothing had been proven at the time, but now it seemed the Gestapo had found new cause. Coenders' arrest, as relayed through anxious gossip, was swift and unceremonious. His wife had reportedly returned home to find their flat sealed, and no official record of his whereabouts had been made public. The message was clear: the Gestapo had shifted from suspicion to enforcement. And they were probing the very edge of van der Veen's operational world. He responded with a tightening of his own routine. No more reroutes from his main console, too easy to trace. Instead, he began timing his shifts to coincide with peak hour traffic when the volume of transmissions created more room for undetected errors. He ceased lingering in the relay room after his scheduled hours and stopped making handwritten notes, relying instead on mental memorization. The men who operated under a sense of technical detachment, who spoke in cables and timestamps, would be harder to single out. Those who lingered or tried to over-control the system stood out. But the system itself was fraying. In early April, van der Veen received a memo from the regional telegraph supervisor notifying all staff of a new compliance protocol. All corrupted or undeliverable transmissions were to be reported directly to a newly formed internal office led by a German technical overseer, Herr Dietrich Fuchs. Fuchs, a civilian on paper, was known to be closely affiliated with the Sicherheitspolizei. He carried himself with the precision of a man used to hierarchy, but his questions during spot inspections revealed a deeper familiarity with counterintelligence procedures than with routine engineering. Van der Veen first met him during a morning audit. Fuchs stood silently behind the Dutch supervisor as van der Veen demonstrated his standard message handling procedure. The German asked no questions, merely observed. His presence, however, left a distinct impression. His gaze lingered not on the main routing console but on the side terminal used for overflow traffic. In the days following the inspection, van der Veen noticed something he hadn't expected. Minor adjustments had been made to the automatic relay scheduler. The buffer that previously held up to 12 undelivered messages before requiring manual clearance had been reduced to 6. This meant corrupted or delayed messages would now pile up faster, forcing operators to act on them or flag them, both of which risked oversight from Fuchs' new office. It was a subtle change, but a significant one. Whoever had made it understood the basic rhythm of signal traffic. Someone was watching not just what messages were being passed, but how long they were lingering, and why. Under this new constraint, van der Veen was forced to adapt again. He began inserting intentional checksum mismatches in routine, non-sensitive messages, old inventory reports, signal receipts, and minor route confirmations. These errors would force the system to hold those transmissions longer, buying him buffer room to delay more critical signals without drawing attention. He also began subtly adjusting the timestamps on select outgoing traffic, using the operator override code. A 10-minute discrepancy was easy to attribute to human error, and within those 10 minutes, vital gaps could be created in the Gestapo's pursuit web. Still, his confidence was eroding. Each morning, he approached his console with the awareness that one misstep, one signal too often rerouted, one delay too precisely timed, could raise suspicion. He began sleeping less, often waking before dawn and checking over his limited notes, burned nightly after transcription. The quiet war he fought inside the walls of the Telegraph office offered no assurance of outcome, only risk measured in fragments of silence. Then, in mid-April, a new pattern emerged. A flurry of transmissions from the Friesland field office arrived in quick succession, each referencing a supposed, confirmed sighting of escapees near Barneveld. This was unusual. Barneveld sat nearly equidistant between Utrecht and Apeldoorn, but far enough off the main line to avoid heavy surveillance. The Gestapo rarely operated there unless they were acting on specific intelligence. What unsettled van der Veen wasn't the location, it was the timing. That morning he had observed 2 encrypted signals being sent from a local routing node near Amersfoort with Dutch origin markers. These were not Gestapo signals but low-frequency Morse pings used by courier relays. Underground operatives, possibly part of the Utrecht-based group known as LO, Landelijke Organisatie voor Hulponderzoekers, had likely transmitted those messages. And now, less than 3 hours later, the Gestapo appeared to be moving in that direction. He reviewed the traffic again. The Gestapo wasn't guessing. They were reacting, which meant that somewhere either a transmission had been intercepted or a mole had been planted in the local networks. Van der Veen made a fateful choice that day. For the first time, he intentionally intercepted a Gestapo signal mid-transit and rerouted it not to delay, but to misinform. He replaced the secondary routing code in the message, a numeric string used to determine deployment coordinates, with a set that would redirect security forces toward an adjacent town, Veen. It was not a long-term solution. Sooner or later, the discrepancy would be noticed. But for a window of several hours, the Gestapo would be chasing shadows. That evening, Van der Veen walked home through streets newly dusted with spring pollen. Shop fronts were shuttered, tram lines quiet. He passed 2 German patrolmen on bicycles but paid them no attention. In his coat pocket, he carried a folded slip of scrap paper, an intercepted directive he had memorized and copied for later review. The destination codes on it matched a corridor being monitored by the Gestapo's wireless teams. If they were tracking escapees through signal triangulation, he would need to reconfigure his own transmissions even more carefully. The boundary between sabotage and silence was narrowing, and somewhere beyond the reach of the cables, someone was still running. By late April 1943, the pressure on Dutch telegraph infrastructure had escalated into a silent, invisible contest of precision and concealment. The Gestapo's pursuit of fugitives from Friesland, still unnamed in official traffic, continued to ripple through the relay network, manifesting in dense chains of short, directive-heavy telegrams. In response, Arie van der Veen's cautious interference grew more deliberate, more targeted. What had begun as subtle routing delays had become quiet acts of deception, precisely engineered to misdirect a vast and unforgiving machinery. But he now operated in a different environment. The Utrecht Central Office, once a space of routine civilian duty, had begun to feel like a forward position in contested territory. Gestapo presence was no longer limited to censors and auditors. Uniformed officers now made regular rounds through the facility. At least 2 Dutch employees were dismissed without explanation within a span of 10 days, one from the routing desk, the other from the equipment room. Rumors followed. One had been accused of removing carbon copies from the transmission log. The other had supposedly failed to report a suspicious checksum override. Van der Veen adjusted accordingly. He narrowed his focus to a single line of effort: interference with Gestapo pursuit signals related to the Friesland escapees. He ignored everything else. There was neither time nor margin to act more broadly. Then came a signal that forced a turning point. On the morning of April 28, at 6:43, a priority-coded message arrived from Arnhem, directed to 5 separate regional offices, including Utrecht. It bore the standard urgency tag, dringend, but included a new, unfamiliar classification, Actionsnet Sigma. This tag was accompanied by a detailed set of instructions regarding coordination between signal monitoring stations, local police units, and railway inspectors. Most notably, it requested technical data about Morse pulse repetition intervals and operators' signature variances. To any ordinary telegraph technician, The request seemed obscure, merely technical. But to Van der Veen, it meant only one thing. The Gestapo was no longer chasing fugitives through geography. They were attempting to trace them through the fingerprints left by the very operators assisting them. He stared at the message in silence. Morse operators, like typists or violinists, carry unconscious habits in their hands, slight hesitations between certain letters, variations in pressure, rhythm, and cadence. Trained monitoring teams could, with time and data, begin to build profiles of individual operators. In Germany, the Sicherheitsdienst had already developed such methods. Now those methods were arriving in the Netherlands. Van der Veen was no longer interfering with an abstract system. He was being profiled. He made his decision within the hour. That afternoon, instead of returning directly home after his shift, he took a circuitous route toward the southern canal district of Utrecht. After confirming he wasn't followed, he entered the rear door of a modest bicycle repair shop run by his cousin, Willem Meyer, a known contact for the local resistance. The two men had not spoken openly in months. Even now, they exchanged no greetings. "I need a message carried west," Van der Veen said, voice low. "No code. Direct delivery. And I need it soon." Meyer didn't ask for details. He produced a sheet of folded paper from beneath the counter and passed it across. Van der Veen scribbled the contents quickly, a set of transmission frequencies, location codes, and a final line, "Pattern compromise likely. Relocate operator routes immediately." The note was destined for the Elos Utrecht cell, likely to be passed by bicycle courier to Amersfoort, and then to resistance liaisons further west. Van der Veen did not know who operated the clandestine radios helping fugitives escape. He didn't need to. His message would reach them. That was enough. With that action, Van der Veen crossed a line he had, until now, managed to avoid. Delaying and rerouting signals was still technically within the gray area of operational discretion, exploitable, deniable. But this was an overt act of collaboration. He had initiated unauthorized communication with an underground network and passed along classified technical information that could directly undermine a Gestapo operation. If discovered, he would not be questioned. He would be detained and disappeared. That same night, Van der Veen returned home to find a uniformed patrol walking slowly along his street, stopping occasionally to glance at door numbers. He kept walking, bypassed his own residence, and did not return until midnight. The patrol had moved on by then, but the message had been received. The scrutiny was tightening. Days passed without incident, but the weight of uncertainty pressed in. On May 3rd, during the early shift, another unusual transmission arrived, this time marked with the prefix Sigma Trace 12. The contents were brief, a directive to investigate anomalies in operator pulse signatures within the Utrecht region. The list included timestamps and lines used for military routing. One of the listed codes matched a relay station where Van der Veen had introduced subtle delays the week prior. He realized the pattern had been noticed. The relay station in question was operated during the night shift by a young technician named Hendrik Thoma. Just 22, Thoma had limited experience and was known for his nervous demeanor. Van der Veen feared that under pressure, the young man might reveal anything, whether true or not. That evening, Van der Veen returned to the bicycle shop. "I need another message sent," he said simply. This one was shorter: "Cease Utrecht relay use. Assume operator ID compromised. Burn pads. Reassign contact points." The courier nodded. No questions. Back at the Telegraph office, Van der Veen began preparing for the possibility of abrupt departure. He sorted through the logbooks, careful not to leave patterns. He removed any trace of his operator override history, small changes executed with caution. He began minimizing contact with other staff. By now, the risk was no longer theoretical. Then came the visit. On May 5th, at 8:10, two men in civilian overcoats arrived at the office and requested to speak with Operator Veen. They showed identification from the Reichspost inspection, the German Communications Authority, but their accents and posture betrayed their true affiliation. They were Gestapo. Van der Veen met them calmly. He was led to a side office and asked a series of administrative questions: how messages were queued, how delays were processed, what procedures were followed for corrupted signals. They asked about recent anomalies in the routing board, about specific days. Nothing accusatory. Not yet. They did not mention the Friesland manhunt. They did not ask about resistance traffic. But the implication lingered in every measured pause. Then one of the men asked a final question. Had Van der Veen, in the course of his duties, noticed any irregularities in the signals routed through station Utrecht 4K? Van der Veen's answer was precise. No. No irregularities to report. They thanked him. One of them made a short note in a ledger, and they left. He returned to his console. For the remainder of his shift, he processed each transmission with calm precision, unaware that just 30 kilometers away, on the road between Amersfoort and Hilversum, a Gestapo vehicle had taken a wrong turn and failed to locate a group of escapees who had vanished the night before. The rerouting had worked. But the cost was becoming clearer. Van der Veen had assumed the risk. It was now personal. The days following the Gestapo visit passed in a kind of stillness, outwardly unchanged, but undercut by the knowledge that something had shifted. Arie van der Veen's routines remained intact, his performance apparently unremarkable, and yet he knew he had stepped over a threshold. He was no longer manipulating a system from within. He had become an identified variable inside it. By the second week of May 1943, the frequency of Sigma-class transmissions lessened slightly. Either the Gestapo's trace effort had yielded diminishing returns, or, more likely, their targets had vanished beyond the radius of surveillance. In either case, Van der Veen took no comfort. The absence of inquiry did not mean absence of suspicion. If anything, it suggested that the investigation had gone quiet because it had shifted elsewhere, deeper, more selective. He resumed his interference, but in scaled-back form. Each action was now measured against the possibility of retroactive scrutiny. He avoided all message rerouting and instead confined his sabotage to precise time delays, no more than 4 or 5 minutes, never more than once per shift, never during the same hour on consecutive days. Even these minor manipulations were stressful. Any anomaly, even one embedded in normal technical noise, could invite renewed attention. In early June, the Gestapo resumed their interest in the Utrecht Telegraph facility, but through different means. Rather than direct presence, they initiated a series of efficiency reviews under the cover of the Reichspost. These reviews were not audits of political loyalty, but performance-based evaluations conducted by visiting engineers. Ostensibly neutral, these men carried detailed traffic logs and queried operators about signal lag, processing errors, and repeated retransmissions. Van der Veen was summoned on June 7. The inspector, a Berliner with a clipped manner and clipboard, reviewed his logs from the previous month. The questions were purely technical, but pointed. Why had a coded signal from Deventer on May 14 been retransmitted twice? Why had another from Zwolle required checksum correction when the equipment registered no line fault? Van der Veen replied with clean logic: marginal line interference, overlapping pulses from adjacent nodes, a possible miscalibration at Zwolle. The inspector made no comment, only wrote, then dismissed him. Van der Veen knew then that the system was closing in, not with force, but with pattern analysis. They were no longer hunting people, they were hunting outliers. In a network designed for mechanical precision, deviations stood out with increasing clarity. His position was becoming untenable. In late June, resistance couriers delivered a coded message to the Utrecht LO cell. Its content was passed to Van der Veen through Willem Meyer, again at the rear of the bicycle shop. The message was simple: routing shift successful. Friesland group exfiltrated via Breda. Operators advised to stand down. Suspend technical aid unless reactivation code sent. It was, for Van der Veen, the first confirmation that his quiet work had yielded a result. The fugitives, whose names he would never know, had made it beyond the manhunt corridor, across the province, and into the southern Netherlands. Breda sat close to the Belgian border. From there, if the underground lines held, they could reach neutral territory. But the message also signaled the end of that phase. He was being told, in coded form, to stop. And yet, stopping was not a clean matter. Van der Veen's profile had been built, not by what he had done once, but by what he had done repeatedly. Even if he ceased all interference, the record of his past behavior, known or inferred, might still surface. He began to prepare for the possibility of being removed from his post. But rather than wait for dismissal or arrest, he attempted to preempt it with a transfer. On July 3, he submitted a formal request for relocation to a satellite telegraph office in Gouda, citing family health issues and the stress of his current position. It was a plausible request. Operators were sometimes moved to reduce workload or to replace retiring staff in less critical areas. The application was quietly declined. No reason was given. Then, in mid-July, Van der Veen received unexpected news. His cousin Willem Meyer had been detained during a Gestapo sweep in the southern district. It was said to be routine. Several men had been questioned after an informant reported bicycle parts being used to conceal false bottom compartments. Meyer was held for 3 days and then released. But when Van der Veen next visited the repair shop, he found the rear room cleared, the spare key gone, the signal books burned. The message was clear. The cell had been compromised. It was dissolving itself. Van der Veen returned to work the next morning, said nothing, and kept to his duties. But the effort required to appear unaffected was immense. The insulation that had once existed between his quiet acts and the larger resistance had thinned. And he had no idea who, if anyone, might be watching him now. On July 19, an internal memo circulated through the Utrecht facility. It was a German-language directive informing all staff that future reroutes or checksum edits would require logging with the new Verbindungsbeverstel, the line verification office, in Amsterdam. The directive was dense with technical jargon, but its core function was clear. Every deviation would now be recorded centrally. The days of discretion were over. With his methods curtailed and his contacts gone silent, Van der Veen found himself once again surrounded by the neutrality of cables and keys. But it was a different kind of neutrality now, not the quiet of tactical waiting, but the cold indifference of a system that had reabsorbed him. He had done what he could. The corridor had been opened. The escapees had passed through. The network had held, for a time. But now the system had begun to close again, and there was no certainty that the next breach would be possible. By early August 1943, the telegraph office in Utrecht had settled into a new equilibrium, stricter, colder, and more mechanical. The routine transmissions still flowed, train schedules, weather alerts, troop resupply notes, coded movements of Einsatzkommandos. But the human elements had been stripped back. Gestapo surveillance, while less visible than before, continued to cast its shadow. Operators spoke more softly, if at all, and no one lingered after their shift. The silence that now hung over the facility was not one of peace, but of caution. Arie van der Veen remained at his post. He had ceased all acts of interference. No more time delays, no more checksum edits, no more covert notes passed across town. His hands tapped out only what was required, his eyes focused solely on the green-lit console in front of him. If anyone had ever confirmed his previous manipulations, they had chosen not to act, yet. Whether that was due to lack of proof, overburdened priorities, or a decision to monitor him longer, he did not know. And he dared not ask. The escapees he had helped, the group that had eluded the Friesland manhunt, were never officially named in any post-war documentation. It is presumed, from later resistance logs and fragments of Allied communications, that at least 5 individuals passed through the Utrecht corridor in spring 1943, aided by a network of radio operators and disguised couriers. Of these, 2 were believed to be Jewish civilians in hiding. The others possibly included a courier affiliated with the Dutch communist resistance and a downed British airman whose presence was never confirmed. The details remain hazy, by design. The fewer names recorded, the safer the network remained. Van der Veen himself never claimed credit. He continued working at the Utrecht telegraph station through the remainder of the occupation. His personnel file, reviewed by the Post-Liberation Investigative Board in 1945, lists no formal infractions, no citations, and no documented suspicions of resistance activity. It simply records a long period of service and notes that he was demobilized in October 1945 when the PTT resumed national operations under the restored Dutch government. His name appeared only once in the testimony of a former resistance member in a post-war archive housed in The Hague. The statement reads, "The man in Utrecht, older, quiet in the relay room, he delayed the signals. Without that, I think they'd have been caught on the Apeldoorn line." Nothing further was added. In the years that followed, van der Veen returned to a modest civilian life. He lived alone, took early retirement in the 1950s, and passed away in 1961. No obituary recorded his role. No plaque marked his desk. He had never been a formal member of the resistance, never held a code name, never carried a pistol or helped sabotage a rail line. He had no citations from the London-based Dutch government in exile, and no contact with the post-war network of decorated resistance veterans. His contribution was quieter, measured not in declarations but in delays, not in explosions, but in the absence of a door being kicked in. And perhaps that is the deeper truth of many such stories from occupied Europe, where small, imperceptible actions within rigid systems made the difference between capture and escape, between life and disappearance. Arie van der Veen did not see himself as a hero, but someone survived because he hesitated, because he waited, because he chose at the right moment not to send a signal.